Hey, Bourbon Bay, good morning. This is Steve, your host, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on whenever you guys are watching this. Decided to try to do this episode a little earlier to avoid all the heat, but yeah, in Florida, never gonna avoid that heat. Mm-mm. Already like 10:30 and I'm sweating like crazy. So excuse me sometimes if I go and wipe my eyebrows. But yeah, so I hope you guys are having a good day. And as always, hope you guys want to come and have a drink with me. Today's feature bourbon that we're going to discuss is Michter's American Whiskey, and this is their small batch bourbon. They do have a couple other offerings, such as their sour mash, their rye. I think they also have a toasted oak too. Single barrels. So yeah, actually no single barrels. I forgot. Yeah, they don't do a single barrel offering yet. And yeah, so we're going to try that out today. I'm also on Twitch. So if you guys want to go follow me on Twitch, I'm streaming live on that as well. Kind of a little bit more behind the scenes as I get ready for these episodes. Yeah, so I thank you guys for joining me. And so yeah, we're going to pour ourselves a glass today. So everybody, hope you guys got some good bourbons in or whatever you like to drink. And as always, write me down in the comments because I always love to hear what you guys are having. So yeah, this is the Michter's and the bourbon small batch. It's about 91 proof, about 45.7% alcohol by volume. So yeah, I mean, it's a relatively what your most bourbons you find these days are. I know a lot of them you can find around 80 proof, but I like a little higher. So, and yeah, typically what I get out of this when I'm smelling it, and it's going to be like, get a little bit of bubble gum, definitely get that honey. And I also get some caramel, as always, with bourbons. And then you definitely some spicy stone fruit notes in there. And so as we kind of go in for our first little sip, yeah, definitely pick up that bubble gum. Definitely also get some like, and I know I've been saying this last couple videos, but I do get some orange and some other stone fruit. I also get a little blueberry, I think, in there too. And strange enough, maybe even a little strawberry. But yeah, so if you guys are drinking Michter's bourbon with me, definitely write down in the comments what you guys are thinking or what you guys get as a flavor palette. And yeah, so and then we're gonna do a little trivia question. Make sure you guys have been watching the videos. So like basically, you know, so sorry. Ah man, it's a little hot out here. But yeah, if you guys who was the president that basically removed the excise tax that freed up distillers and basically helped to encourage more growth with the American whiskey. So if you guys stay to the end of the video, you'll definitely find out the answers. Always, again, write it down in the comments so I can see. But yeah, so just to kind of go in a little bit of back history with Michter's bourbon. So it was a bourbon that was originally started by a gentleman named John Schick, who was a Swiss Mennonite, and this was back in 1753 when they say that their history kind of began. And then it was later purchased by a gentleman called Bumberger, and this was all in Pennsylvania, and they were originally a rye whiskey, which back in the day, back during that time frame, pretty much all whiskeys were either a rye or a malt whiskey. It was just the grain that was available at the time and was relatively easy to produce. So kind of skipping ahead about to the 1800s is when Baumberger came in, purchased the distillery from Scheck, and began producing bourbon there. And then again, skipping further ahead, you have the Prohibition time frame, as they like to say, and that's when basically after the Prohibition, when it was repealed in the 1930s, you basically had a gentleman named. Sorry about this, guys. This heat is killing me. So yeah, the gentleman who was named Lou Foreman. That's who it was. Sorry, guys. So Lou Foreman, as the story goes, purchased the distillery after it was sold many times once it came back from Prohibition. And he named the distillery Michter's after his son's two first names, which was Michael and Peter. And I guess you could definitely say that was definitely a lot better than Petner or Petner or something like that. So definitely a good name choice with Michter's. And so, yeah, it definitely grew. And then, of course, after that, it was purchased by Joseph Magliolo and one of his college buddies, Newman. And they made Michter's and moved it to Kentucky, where it is now. There's the famous Fort Brooks distillery out there in Louisville, downtown Louisville, on Bourbon Row, or the Museum Row, as it's like to be known. And yeah, so basically, really nice little bourbon, has some nice American history. I mean, they'll like to tell you this was the bourbon that, or the rye that warmed the soldiers of the American Revolution's heart. And actually, George Washington visited the distillery when it was in Pennsylvania and purchased the whiskey for his men. So they like to kind of talk about that as part of their history. And so, yeah, definitely a good bourbon to check out. I mean, I won't say it's my favorite, but definitely a good bourbon, especially not super expensive. I think it's around, I want to say about $40. Kind of had a funny little story when I got it from my store a couple of days ago. First time I got it, and of course, bought another whiskey with it. I put it in my car after work and in the back seat. Basically, was picking up some food for dinner. And during that trip, kind of had to make a little hard stop. And then, so I guess it ended up on the floor. And then when I got home, I reached down, picked it up, noticed that the bag was wet. And I just immediately was like, oh, shit. Started feeling each bottle. The one other bourbon I bought was fine. This bourbon seemed fine until I got to the top. I picked up the bag and noticed that the top of it had completely come off. And pretty much all of it was gone in the backseat of my car. So yeah, for a while, the backseat or my entire car smelled like bourbon, which, any other time is really cool. Not when you're driving, because you definitely don't want to get pulled over and have that happen. But yeah, so that's I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to that story. It's probably happened many times before to you guys. But yeah, so we're going to kind of go now into the formative years. So that time frame between, the American Revolution and the Civil War, and even a little bit after the Civil War. Sorry, guys. It's just really hot out here. Probably one of the last times I'm going to be outside for at least until fall, because it's just too hot to be doing this stuff out here. So basically, during this time after that, you had some families who started to become really big in making whiskey. Of course, the George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, like we talked about in a video or two ago, about the excise tax that they put in place to pay for the American Revolution. Well, this really put a damper for a while on small farmers, people who were just making whiskey to kind of do something else with their crops to try to save it for the next season. And, so people like the Pepper family, which was one of the big families at the time, they were the only ones that could really, distill and pay the tax. And many people during that time frame were arrested. So like in 1798, you had probably over 200 Kentucky men, including people like Elijah Craig, and who were arrested and charged with making whiskey without a license. And then you had other suppliers, other farmers who were then supplying the grains to, families like Pepper, who would then make the whiskey there up in like places like Pennsylvania, in Maryland as well. So yeah, you basically, and then in 1816, there was a New Englander who came and made and incorporated a huge distillery in Kentucky, basically bought up like 100 acres or so in near Louisville, had $100,000 in capital, which if you think about it at that time, that was probably close to definitely a couple $1,000,000 in today's money, which is pretty impressive at that time. Probably made them one of the richest people, one of the richest distilleries companies during that time frame. And yeah, so they basically had huge machinery that would would do the grain millings, and basically did a lot of this, was made with tons and tons of copper, used a lot of it, but of course it only lasted a couple years, because after that time frame they used up all their capital, so they eventually closed, and the New Englander went back to making rum. So yeah, it was definitely kind of a crazy time. And then during this time frame, a little later, you had what was in 1825 the Lincoln County process, which everybody who loves Jack Daniels will definitely know. And that was started by a Tennessean named Alfred Eaton. But even though he's credited for starting the Lincoln County process, where they basically take maple char oak chips, and then it's about 10 feet that they filter right after they distill the process, and it's distilled. They put it through about 10 feet of this maple charcoal, which is filters it out. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of also known that he wasn't the only one who did this process. You also had some people out in Kentucky who were using other things like white sand, white linen cloth, and then also very finely grained charcoal. And they were only doing it like a couple feet or something like that. So, yeah, so it wasn't definitely the only process that was being used, but it's definitely become the most famous one, especially with the big guys like Jack Daniels being the one that totally uses that process right now. And kind of going further in history, we have the Industrial Revolution happened during this time in the U.S. and Great Britain. Some pretty big things happened as well during this time frame. The U.S. and Spain signed an agreement in 1789 that basically gave access to the United States of the Mississippi River, which then became known as the Old Man's Back, who carried pretty much all the products from the American heartland at the time down to New Orleans, which became one of the largest ports in the country at that time frame. And sorry. But yeah, and so basically, and then of course, after not too long after that, our president Thomas Jefferson then had the Louisiana Purchase, which basically doubled the size of our country, included places such as Missouri, Arkansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, parts of Minnesota, and of course, Arkansas, Louisiana. So yeah, that helped to double it. And then as people moved westward, you started to get more people. And as they got further away from the East Coast, the chance of them purchasing things like molasses became even more expensive. So they started to switch from distilling things like rum into more of a distilling of whiskey. So this is where kind of whiskey became very huge, was during this time frame. And yeah, so basically you definitely have more of this process going on. And then there was what further kind of helped to kill the molasses or rum production in the U.S. was that, of course, the slave trade was banned, and then you had in 1807 the Embargo Act, which restricted importation of molasses from British ports, because yes, we were still not very happy with the British, even though we had a treaty that ended the American Revolution. Trade wasn't really happening. There were still little skirmishes here and there. Which kind of eventually led up to the War of 1812, as we'll get into. And then so that happened in 1807, and it also banned more of the use of slaves in that time frame. So people couldn't really keep importing the slaves. They had to, so because slaves were a very integral part in the distillation of rum at the time. And so, it ended what was called the triangle trade among the U.S., Africa, and the East Indies, or the West Indies. And that, basically kind of killed off the rum industry in the U.S. And then also going kind of back to the Industrial Revolution, we had a gentleman named Anise Coffees, who was in Britain, and he really helped to change the whiskey industry when he developed the continuous column still. But we wouldn't really get that until after the Civil War. A lot of the people at the time, many of the big distillers were still using pot stills, but more like the farmers, the frontiersmen, they were using more like what was called the log and copper process, which is where they would take a log, cut it in half, hollow it out, and then reseal it back up and fill it with the fermentation, where that's where they would do the fermentation, and then it would be heated. And the process, like I talked about one of my episodes when it came to the distillation process, where you had it go and it would be funneled in through, which was usually kind of like a copper funnel that they put on top of the log, and there would be a long pipe that the condensed or that the steam would go through, and as it would go through, it would get condensed into another pot. But a lot of them did say that after this process, they would then put it into a traditional pot still and redistill it to bring up the alcohol content and make it a higher alcohol content. But yeah, guys, so I kind of hope you enjoy some of this formative year stuff. This is probably going to be part one of a 2-part series. There's a lot of information that kind of happens. If you want to go a little bit more in depth, I do have my podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, where I go a little bit more in detail. And again, that's still going to be a part one of a part 2 series, or part 3, depending on how long it takes to kind of get these. So that's about a 30-minute video or a 30-minute podcast if you guys want to switch in and tune into that. And so just hope you guys enjoyed. And if you guys didn't hear that, Thomas Jefferson, of course, is the president that helped to repeal. And so that was the answer to the trivia question. But so again, guys, I hope you enjoyed. Give me some comments. Let me know what you think of the video. If you guys got any ideas on how I can make this show better, again, write them down in the comments. Also, what you guys want me to talk about in the next episodes, maybe. So just always give me some feedback. Love to hear the feedback. Hope you guys enjoyed. And if you guys are going to have a drink, hope you guys get it or have it with me. And salud. Well, I hope you guys